Thank you so much for being here. We're about making change. We're about making a difference, and your presence is going to help us do that. We want to absolutely thank you for taking the time, for deciding that this webinar was worth your time and your energy and the opportunity to join in the conversation. We at STEM Funders Network, we are just absolutely energized about being here and about being with you today, and more importantly, about the amazing speakers that are going to come forward and bring forward our inaugural Power of Positive Influence, which will be focusing on the racial diversity, equity, and inclusion in science education project brought to you by the LabXchange and funded and supported by the Amgen Foundation. That was a mouthful, but all that to say good stuff and great things forthcoming. So please put your questions in the Q&A. Our panelists are excited and ready to answer your questions. And if you see a question that resonates with you, do this on there and give it an upvote. And that helps us to know how relevant a question is, because if we see a question with 6 upvotes out there, that means, hey, we really need to come back and respond to that. And I'm going to turn it over because this really isn't about STEM Funders Network. This is about the great things that happen because of the organizations that are a part of our network. So that being said, please let me introduce you to Dr. Marty Samuels. He's the head of content at LabXchange. And before joining LabXchange, Marty earned his PhD in biochemistry at Harvard. He then served as the assistant director for undergraduate studies for the molecular and cellular biology department, where he co-taught a dozen courses and advised undergraduates in that concentration. He then joined Harvard's Derek Bach Center for Teaching and Learning as the Associate Director for Science. At the Bach Center, one of his responsibilities was to help lead professional development workshops for high school educators. So that's a great segue, Marty, to toss it over to you and let you take it from here. Thanks so much for being here.
Oh, thank you so much, Erica. And that's such a kind introduction. For those of you who aren't familiar with LabXchange, let me just spend a moment briefly describing our work and our project and how this project came to be. LabXchange is a free Harvard-based science education platform dedicated to making high-quality, interactive science education materials that are freely available and accessible to anyone. And our mission is to make science a more inclusive and diverse discipline. And we can do all of this with generous funding from the Amgen Foundation. And by the way, while I'm being brief in our description of our platform, we have members of our team who are in the chat, and they can answer any questions you may have. In 2020, horrified by the murders of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and Ahmaud Arbery, among so many others, and inspired by the Black Lives Matter movement, we knew that we wanted to generate high quality content that spoke to the impact of racism on science, science education, and medicine, but we knew that we lacked the expertise to do so. So we reached out to expert faculty from around the country to serve as a steering committee to direct the work of 20 graduate student fellows who are, as we speak, building content focused around 2 central topics. First, on racism as a public health crisis, and secondly, on how to teach using anti-racist and inclusive principles to prepare all of our students to succeed. We're excited to start rolling this project out, which is called the Racial Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion in Science Education Project, later this year. And my main role today is going to be to facilitate a conversation with the 3 members of our steering committee meeting who are leading the development of this anti-racism and inclusive education project. But before we begin this exciting conversation, I'd just like to introduce our amazing panelists. Since time does not allow me to list their extensive list of accomplishments, I will briefly introduce each of them, and my colleagues will provide a bit more information in the chat. Let me begin with Dr. Jamelia Brooks. Dr. Brooks is an assistant director at the Center for Teaching and Learning at the University of Pennsylvania, and formerly the founding director of the Teaching Assistant Program at Berea College. Her primary work focuses on programming and support for equitable and inclusive teaching practices, and her current work traces and historicizes pedagogical practices of colonial education that persist through to our present day. Dr. Ivy Tolson is a professor in the Department of Human Development and Psychoeducational Studies at Howard University. He is also the president of Quality Education for Minorities, the editor-in-chief of the Journal of Negro Education, and the executive editor of the Journal of Policy Analysis and Research. He previously served on the President Obama's White House Initiative on Historically Black Colleges and Universities. And finally, Dr. Joseph Graves Jr. is a professor in the Department of Biology at North Carolina Agricultural and Technical State University. His research involves the genomics of adaptation, and he is the author of several books, most recently, Racism, Not Race, Answers to Frequently Asked Questions, which was recently just glowingly reviewed in Science. And with that, I'll begin by asking the first question of Dr. Tolson. Professor Tolson, as a professor who sees students matriculate into a classroom from K through 12 education, what does K through 12 education currently do really well? And what are students missing when they get to your classroom?
Okay. Yeah, thank you for the question, and thank you for bringing this all together. I really admire this project and the outstanding people that you brought to get expertise from. I think is commendable. So, what does K through 12 do right? And I like the way you phrased that, because you forced me to say something good about K through 12 first. So let's oblige. K through 12 in the United States is a very comprehensive system that gives universal education to all, and that's not a easy thing to accomplish. Now, that being said, there is a lot of unevenness in how education is distributed in this country, and unfortunately, there are huge racial disparities when it comes to what students are getting. Now, when I have students, there's variance in how much they've been prepared for college. And I think that variance is by design. But if we were to talk to the ones that seem to be very well prepared for college and ask them, what did you get in K through 12 that's making you such an outstanding student right now? Typically, they'll talk about individual teachers that they had that really motivated them. Now, these are teachers that only a few students have the opportunity to take, but teachers that make an outstanding imprint on the lives of the students that they teach. And then you have some that had the opportunity to go to a good school. Again, these are schools that not all students have the opportunity to take. Now, the problem is that a lot of the variance that I see coming into college reflects the variances in opportunities that students have before they come, not necessarily variance in their ability. And unfortunately, in our country, in this capitalistic society, we like to have these haves and have-nots. And we're primed to think that way. We're not even primed to think that every single student should be on the same level. We're primed to think that some are going to have more than others. But I think that if we restructured education and if we thought differently about our role and responsibilities to all students, we don't have to think about it in terms of students who will have more than others. What needs to change with education? When I think about the teachers who are doing it best, a lot of them are doing it in a way that what they're doing isn't rewarded appropriately. The way that we have this hierarchical model, this top-down approach, it doesn't allow for us to really truly learn from teachers who can offer more expertise in how to deal with a wide range of students than perhaps the superintendent or the top office. So I think we need to restructure it, reconfigure education from this hierarchical approach to one that's based on distributed agency, where we look at teachers who are doing really good work with some of the students that we may think are the hardest to reach, and be able to codify their practices to reach the entire system. We also need to reprioritize what we think of as good teachers. Right now, we're still in this mode of thinking of good teachers as the smartest teachers, the teachers who have demonstrated that they know how to do schoolwork well, but not the teachers who have demonstrated that they have this humanistic quality to them where they can motivate and inspire students. Since schools are using technology in so much more robust ways. In many ways, technology becomes the cognitive arm of the school. And so we can learn all of these different disciplines through the strategic use of technology. What technology can't do is show a student that they care about them or motivate a student to do better. So these are some of the things I think schools could do better.
Amazing. Thank you, Dr. Tolson. Dr. Brooks, maybe I could pose the same question to hear your thoughts. What do you think K through 12 is doing right? And you know, what are students kind of lacking when they come into your classroom in that sense?
Thank you. Thank you for the question. And I want to extend Dr. Tolson's comments, because I think that that phrase or that term uneven is very, very true. Students have very differential experiences. And I think focusing that idea is brilliant, to focus on the instructors that are doing things right. And I think that these instructors are the ones that aren't teaching to the test, but are teaching to experience in the class and in the classroom and beyond the classroom. And I want to acknowledge that teachers are doing, you know, the Lord's work. They're doing something very, very challenging right now. So those who can take the time to think through what a real experience is beyond the textbook, beyond the test, I think is important. I think this question of, you know, who are the instructors who are reaching and teaching students, and the students who are hard to reach. And to that, I just have two book suggestions. Chris Emden, who wrote one book for white folks who teach in the hood, and the rest of y'all too. And he has a series of books actually. And then Matt Kay, who's here in Philadelphia, who wrote Not Light But Fire. And this is about holding racial discussions. And reading those texts and the many, many others that are out there are just really inspiring, because it gives you a picture inside the classroom of what that looks like. And they're both very open about what mistakes they make along the way. And they're both very open about the ways that they engage with students. I'm going to turn your question around a little bit, Dr. Samuels, because I do want to make sure that we are not asking questions that reinforce a deficit perspective of our students. And so this question of what are they lacking, I think can be a very dangerous one, because it comes in with this idea of the limitations of who they are and what they bring. So I want to say instead, what are the strengths that they bring? And I would say that the students that I have encountered in the many different types of universities that I have taught at, is that they bring a lot of curiosity still. They bring a lot of creativity. They bring a lot of questions. It hasn't been killed in them yet, but it can be. It can be throughout their college experience if we don't cultivate those kinds of things. And so we really want to be able to do that well, and to do that in a way that will really help them through their university experience.
Thank you, Dr. Brooks, and thank you for flipping that question. That's so well put. And maybe Dr. Graves, if I could ask you something along similar lines, but maybe since you're also a biology professor, if I could ask you to think about it in the framing of STEM, how do you think STEM education is operating at the K through 12 level?
So I'm going to echo some of the comments of the last two speakers with regard to the unevenness of opportunity, which is present in the current K-12 system. Now, I am a professor at the largest historically Black university in the nation. We get students from all over. We have students who walk in here and are overly prepared for anything that we could possibly give them. And they just sail through our curriculum and go on and do fantastic things. But we also bear the burden of much of the unevenness of American education. So for us, it takes a whole lot more work to bring out the capacities of our students, because they really have been victimized. And I don't think we should in any way sugarcoat that or in any way, underrepresent that. I mean, the K-12 system in America is a brutal system of racial injustice. Certain kids get opportunities that other kids are denied. And, unless we are willing to say that and say that in a forthright manner, then we cannot make movement to redress this injustice. And that's what, historically Black universities do. That's been our historical mission. We do it on much less resources than the historically white institutions in our systems have. Our professors are outstanding, research scholars, but we also have to teach a higher teaching load. We also have rundown infrastructure where, the historically white institutions have brand new infrastructure and instrumentation, and we still keep up. We still do excellent work with these students. And so, the message that I like to send out is imagine what we could do if we were properly resourced to carry out the mission that we have been charged with. And that's part of what we discuss in the paper that I put in the chat with my colleagues, Dr. Shirley Malcolm, the director of AAAS Sea Change, with Dr. Gildo Barabino, the president of Olin College of Engineering, and Maureen Kearney from the National Science Foundation. We discussed that in a paper that is going to be published next month in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, in which we talk about the existing inequalities in science, but yet we call for a new agenda. And that agenda, starts with treating the institutions that do the vast majority of the work to help provide opportunity for the most victimized people of racial injustice. If you give us the infrastructure that other institutions have, we will transform this society.
Phenomenal. Thank you so much for that. I wasn't sure if Dr. Tolson, you wanted to respond or follow up.
No, I think you have a few more questions on the deck, so I'll let it flow through.
Sure. So, thank you for that. And maybe I'll ask the next question of Dr. Brooks again. And this kind of speaks to some of the comments you were making earlier. So maybe this will follow straight from Dr. Graves's answers. But there's a little bit of let me just say that there's a debate about how central diversity, equity, and inclusion work should be in education. Should it play a central and foundational role for a high quality K-12 education? Or should it play a peripheral and additional role that it serves as an add-on to talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion work in education? And I was wondering if you could speak to why it is or isn't important to place DEI work at the center of course design and teaching practices.
So this response will not come as a surprise, but I will also elaborate on it. Absolutely, we absolutely have to make it a framework from which we begin, and not something as supplemental, not just one more add-on to do or one extra thing you have to think about. Because in my work, working with instructors, very often when we bring DEI work in, there's a lot of frustration because they have to rethink their entire classes. They have to rethink their entire approaches. It's a lot of work. It is a lot of work, but it's less work if we start from it as a framework for all the things that we do, from all the questions that we ask, from all of our planning about our classes, and from all our conceptualizing about what STEM education is and could be. So I'll back up a little bit and talk about a few reasons why. By the time our students get to university, they're bringing very fixed ideas. They bring fixed ideas about what STEM is, who belongs in STEM, what STEM looks like. And I think that growth mindset is a very popular concept at this stage because of those fixed ideas. I think that's a problem. I think that by the time that students get to university and we're teaching them things like growth mindset, you're putting a Band-Aid on an open wound that has been bleeding for a long time. Back to Dr. Graves' statement that the K-12 system is a brutal system of injustice and racism. It's almost too late, which is not impossible. It's not something that can be unlearned, but it's a huge burden. So this is why we should think of DEI not just as a term or an idea, but an ideology, a way of being and seeing and understanding the world. Anything that tries to not start from equity and justice is an attempt to be neutral. It's an attempt to pose itself of objective, which we know is impossible. So I think about this term, and I'll put these, I'm a big reader on all of these things. But I was reading Dr. Goldie Muhammad's Cultivating Genius, and one of her chapters is on what's called historically responsive literacy. And I like that phrase, historically responsive, because if we think about the history, we think about what Dr. Graves was mentioning, the history of K through 12 education, what our students are experiencing. And then we think of all the way, even before that, the history of our nation as a nation of colonizers, a history of many different forms of colonization that is widespread throughout the globe, many of which had a very anti-Black approach. Then when we use DEI and justice, I would add, as a framework, we are acknowledging that history and responding to that history. And so I think a few questions we can ask ourselves are thinking about, who is being prioritized, who has been and who continues to be prioritized in the classroom and why? What choices are we making in the classroom and why? And thinking about, what are we losing by not framing everything we do from a perspective of equity and justice? And I think we lose a lot. We lose out on innovation. We lose out on ideas. We lose out on people like me who could have gone into STEM because I find those questions so fascinating and was essentially forced out. And so I think that framework is a way of recentering ourselves on what is actually the central to our aims.
Thank you, Dr. Brooks. And Dr. Graves, I was wondering if I could send that question back to you. How do you?
You really want to do that now?
The floor is yours, my friend.
All right. So yeah, I mean, again, I completely agree with Dr. Brooks about DEI being at the center of what we should be doing with regard to scientific research and training. Literally a week ago, had a bunch of folks from the National Science Foundation here, and I really can't tell you about which competition it was because we're still in final review for this award. But one of the things that I think really knocked the committee off their chairs was how central DEI initiatives were to our responsible research and innovation profile in our proposed project. In other words, they had someone on the committee whose expertise was on the social, ethical, and implications of science. And this person came at us as if we were a historically white institution. And I had to put the brakes on them and tell them, wait a minute. I mean, you obviously don't know who you're talking to right now, because our researchers are part of the communities that have been victimized by science that has been, propagated for the benefit of those who socially dominate this society. So we live in those communities. We go to church in those communities. Our social clubs are in those communities. And there is no way we were going to allow any sort of research initiative to go forward that wasn't squarely cognizant of the need for science to do responsible innovation to address the needs of underserved, racially subordinated communities. I mean, for example, the kinds of things that are happening to people in Flint, Michigan. Well, those are the kinds of things that are at the forefront of our mind. So, science, I'll end with this, science is a tool, okay? And it can do great things, but it depends upon, who's using the tool and for what purposes are they using it. And for much of the history of the nation and the world, science has been allied to colonialism and racism and patriarchy and anti-gay bigotry and all other forms of oppression. But there are scientists who have always fought against that stream. And there needs to be a greater constellation of those scientists in the 21st century, because we are now facing existential crises. And our ability to address those existential crises cannot work unless we have everyone at the table.
Thank you, Dr. Graves. And Dr. Tolson, can I ask your thoughts on the role and how to center DEI work in course design and teaching practices?
Yeah, well, of course, I don't believe it should be up for debate anymore. And a lot of times I function as if it's not a debate. It just is. And, one thing that's just moving without, uh, you know, anybody doing anything is the diversity part of it. We have to at least say that that's the foundation because we have a diverse school system now. What we used to call the minority is no longer the minority when we look at K through 12 education, which at this point is less than 50% white. So it's a diverse learning environment, and the numbers just don't add up if we continue to have the same types of racial disparities with the same types of demographic changes. Then we will no longer survive as a nation. We won't be as competitive as we once were. We have to find some kind of way of making sure that students who have not been getting the type of opportunities that they deserve get those opportunities if we want to remain the type of innovative nation, creative nation, one that has a STEM workforce that's really going to take us into the future. So the bigger question is how, and there's a lot of experts that have a lot of different things to say about that. Most of it is legitimate, but I think on a fundamental level, we have to start to strategize around creating the same types of opportunities for all students. We have to look at the funding and the types of ways in which decisions are made about what schools to fund and what schools do not get the funding. Right now, things like property tax being used in order to fund education. We know that that's just a way to create a system where rich people with more properties get better public education than poorer people who are renting. So that's one thing that needs to be eliminated. We also have to start thinking differently about how we recruit, train, certify, and evaluate teachers. Right now, it's still based on some archaic models. When we look at national teacher certification examinations, if you look at the content of it, does any reasonable person think that that content aligns with what someone needs to teach a diverse classroom? It just doesn't. We're to a point that I made earlier, we're still trying to find people who function as closely to computers as they possibly can in order to be an effective teacher. We want teachers with the best memory right now. That's what we want, because everything about the way that we train and certify teachers, it puts teachers with the best memory at the advantage, not the teacher who cares the most, not the teacher who has the best experiences teaching in a diverse environment. It's the teachers that can memorize and regurgitate information. Is that going to cut it? It's not, and it's not even necessary anymore because of the way that we use computers in the classroom. So there's a lot of things that we need to reevaluate about how we structure education in order to create the type of environment that's going to be inclusive for all.
Thank you, Dr. Tolson. What a wonderful set of answers. Dr. Graves, maybe I can start off this question with you. You were actually one of the first faculty members we reached out to when we were reaching out about the Racial Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion in Science Education project. What was it about the project that attracted you to want to work on it or to serve as a steward on this project?
Well, Martin, you know my academic history, but the audience doesn't. So I've been thinking seriously about how people came to think racially from the mid 1990s. And now I've written 4 books on the subject, of which one of them, Racism Not Race, is out right now. Clearly, I don't know how to say it, but race is the elephant in the middle of the American living room, and has always been so since the founding of European, civilization in North America. And without a thoroughgoing understanding of the way racism operates in every facet of American social life, you are graduating people from the education system who are completely unprepared for living in this society. Now, that damage is in some ways less for those who are in groups that are socially dominant, but there is still damage. And certainly it's paralyzing and crippling for people who are the victims of racism. And so if we don't address this elephant, eventually it's going to smother us all. Okay. And we can't keep looking the other way as if, oh, no, racism is not a problem. Okay. It is the problem for which, if we don't solve this problem, then again, all of the existential crises, which I have been describing in various published works over the last couple of years, they're all going to get worse. And I fear could literally lead to the end of even the thin veneer of democracy that exists in the United States.
Thank you, Dr. Graves. Dr. Brooks, I was wondering if I could ask something similar, but maybe in a more pointed direction. In terms of like what we're building for the anti-racist and inclusive education component, what effect do you hope that has on educators, or what do you hope the outcome of that is?
That's great. I think that's an excellent question, because what I think is being done so well, and I'm really just in awe of our graduate student researchers who are doing just excellent work, exploring different things and all that's out there, are two things. The first is that there's just so much information out there, and I think it's hard to know what is good and what can be misleading. And so I pointed, and I kind of, because I already poked at it, I can just mention it again. I poked at the fixed and the growth mindset as one of those things that can be very misleading and very much distracting us from the structural elements of racism that Dr. Graves brought us to. So I think that what I hope that folks can do is it's a way that we pull together a lot of very different resources so that that messages stays consistent. And I hope that it can be inspiring. I hope that people can see some of the innovations and the creativity that people are implementing in their classes. Because I tend to think of classrooms as bubbles in the sense that you're instructing, you're doing your thing. The students will let you know how you're doing at the very end of class through student evaluations, and you're not getting some of that ongoing feedback. And so I hope it to be a site where there could be more exploration and more dialogue around these different things. I'll end with just one quick story, because when I was in college, Oberlin College, in fact, yeah.
I'm an Oberlin grad too, right?
Yes. I had read that and I'd forgotten it. And so when your identity, your bio was put, I was like, oh, that's right. Yeah, so I'm a graduate of Oberlin College, and one of the best classes I took there, because by the time I got to college, I was convinced I could not do science. And they had a requirement. They had a math/science requirement. And so I took this astronomy course. And this instructor just went out of his way. He memorized all 120 of our names. He even had, he turned off, he found a way to get the city to turn off the lights so that we could get rid of the air pollution, the light pollution for the night, and be able to actually look up and see the stars. He made sure that the astronauts we saw and the astronauts we learned about were predominantly Black or people of color or graduate students. So we all were able to see ourselves in that field. And this is something we all can do. It was where I learned about Mae Jemison. It was where I learned about Ronald McNair, who were both, eminent astronauts. And learning about McNair led me to join the McNair program and become a McNair scholar, and see myself in scholarship. So I hope that LabXchange, I hope that this whole project will be a source of inspiration and help others see that they are not the only out there, and that they can do this as others have done before them.
Amazing. Thank you, Dr. Burks. And to Dr. Tolson, just along similar lines, what drew you to the project and what do you hope its impact will be?
To be honest, and I won't give a long answer because Dr. Brooks and Dr. Graves have said most of the things I feel. But it was really because I looked at the other people who signed on, including Dr. Graves and other people from HBCUs. And that was one of the primary reasons I wanted to join. Because I felt like because of the people who you invited to be a part of it, that you were serious. And first I'm seeing, okay, there's this lab that's coming out of Harvard, and had my own stereotypes that came in my head about Harvard. But then when I saw, these are the experts, and I saw myself and I saw the experts, and I just felt like, this is alignment, and this is a project that's serious about doing work that's in the best interest of the people that I care about. And so that's why I signed on.
Amazing. Thank you. And Dr. Toast, I might stay for you with like the last question before we turn to the questions from the audience. I would maybe just like to end with like a question to invite a call to action.
Mhm.
For the teachers in the audience, what can they do tomorrow? For administrators in the audience, what can they do for tomorrow? For potential investors who are looking for projects in K through 12 education to support, and what would you like to see? What kind of projects would you see them to fund? And so I'll kind of throw that out there, but what would you like to see kind of come from conversations like this?
Yeah, such an important question. So the pandemic taught us a lot about education, and I'm afraid that we're missing a lot of the more important lessons in our rush just to get students back to class. We haven't talked enough to the students who seem to have done better while they were at home than at school, and there was a lot of them, and a lot of them came from impoverished communities. In fact, we wanted to rush the poor kids back first when schools were already doing the worst for them. But a lot of them, when you talk to them and their families, they found another level of flexibility. They found that they had more control. They also found that they were being accommodated better. As long as they got the technology, they were in a system where a lot of these things, like who can get to school on time and who's having more challenges, who's wearing new clothes that's fresh and crisp, and who's wearing clothes that is hand-me-downs, who is bringing this good lunch to school and who's not. A lot of those types are who's taller and who's shorter, right? So a lot of these divisions um, ceased to exist during the pandemic, and we have to think about that. Um, we're living in, and when you talk to teachers about, the, the teachers who are socially conscious and the advocates, a lot of them feel constrained by a lot of the ways that education works right now. Good teachers want to teach outside of their classrooms. They want to take their students places. They want to expose their students to things that the students haven't been exposed to. When good teachers think about summer learning loss, they're not assuming that rich kids are in a book the entire summer. They know that rich kids learn because they travel during the summer. And the summer learning loss that they want to cure for with poor kids is to give poor kids those same opportunities to travel for the summer, to do these types of things. Um, and I think from a funding perspective and from a perspective of what we need to do, we need to create an environment that uses the community and uses society, uses the world to augment education and to create immersive educational experiences for students that's beyond this static existence of going to a class, hearing the bell ring, and then going to the next class and focusing just on what students are memorizing, and really using all the tools at our exposure, both the tools that's out there in life and in the environment, and tools through virtual experiences and augmented experiences. So we got to really think differently about what education means. We got to get rid of these paper and pencil tests as the primary measure of what they're learning. We have to give more projects. And I can go on, but I think you get the picture. We need to create a different type of education that takes education outside the classroom into the real world, whether it's a virtual world or the physical world.
Amazing. Dr. Burks, what would you like to see kind of come out of this conversation, or what would you like to see like the next action steps be for audience members?
Those are already some really great ideas. So really quickly, some of the things that I was thinking about through this question was one of the things that happened to us was my spouse and I pulled our kids from school because the response to the pandemic was just so terrible. And the idea of having my then 5-year-old sitting in front of a computer on Zoom for 6 hours a day. And the same for my 7-year-old was really unpalatable. And I recognized that we were very privileged to be able to do that, to be able to homeschool, because it's a lot of work, and my spouse put in a lot of work into thinking about it. But one of the things that we discovered was that by untying ourselves from these curriculums and from these really traditional test taking, like Dr. Tolson mentioned, multiple choice exams, this kind of just very rote memorization, by untethering ourselves from that, our kids really made a lot of tremendous gains. My daughter experienced a lot of math anxiety, and one of the things we did was we made math unavoidable. She had to face it. Oh, you're in the kitchen, you want to make some cookies? Guess what? You're going to do some math. Like, oh, you want to go outside? Guess what? You're going to do some math. So really making it part and parcel of their daily experience. And I think that speaks to what educators can really do is we need to get to know the communities that our schools are in. We need to get to know where they are, because if you don't, then you're simply allowing for that sort of ignorance to frame how it is that you're teaching. And to give an example of that, how often is the Black kid not doing well in the class? How often is it assumed that he just doesn't care? He's just a troublemaker. That his parents aren't, I never see his parents at PTO meetings, so they must not be invested in his education. How often is that the very first assumption that is being made, rather than thinking about alternatively, maybe they do care. Maybe they do care, and what are some things that I can do to really transform that experience? What are the ways that I could cultivate curiosity? What does the kid care about? And using that as a stepping point for making our students, the agencies of their education, and letting them guide their education instead of this top-down, fill the vessel approach that we often bring. So I would say that the first thing that we need to do as educators, and what we should be thinking about, is thinking about what are they invested in, what are they interested in, and how do we engage them?
Phenomenal, thank you. And Dr. Graves, like, what would you want people to leave this conversation thinking about in terms of funding opportunities or priorities or action items?
So I think my take is going to be different from the last two speakers. I see what has happened to the public schools in the United States as being the result of a determined, well thought out policy to destroy public education. Now, the reason why these people wanted to destroy public education is because that was where poor, working class, Black and brown people were being educated. And so the conditions that exist in the American public school system is not accidental. It's really the result of a determined policy to destroy a system, by the way, that Black people fought to create in this country, because there really wouldn't have been public education if, newly freed African Americans in the South hadn't been fighting for that, and then it sort of took off across the nation. So I think what we need is a massive, Marshall Plan level investment in redoing public education. And for those in the audience who say, oh, well, we can't do that, that'll cost too much. You know, I don't want to use the same old platitudes. You know, if you think education is expensive, try continued ignorance, try continued disillusionment, try, you know, a permanent unemployable sector of the American population that will only be capable of consuming, you know, from their food stamps. Okay, that's what's the problem here. And we see this in a variety of individual ways that again are toxic. But again, the system was designed to be toxic. This again, I'm from the no accident school of history. And so since we recognize that there are different agendas here on the table, those of us who are people of goodwill, people of good faith, who have a vision of justice and not a situation where robots are delivering pizza in Houston so that people who used to be in the gig economy now have to find a new gig because they can't deliver pizza anymore. Okay, that's what responsible innovation does not look like. And so what we need is an investment in public education. We need massive funding. We need to raise the salaries of teachers so that we can attract the brightest and the best folks who are committed to these children, who don't, you know, leave because they can't afford to feed their own kids. And so what this nation has to do is has to make a decision on what the nation wants to be. And if we want to be a just, equitable society, then we need to spend the money where it will do the most, and that's in public education.
Amazing. What a fantastic answer. So we've gotten a few questions from the audience, and let me just bounce the first question to everyone. I can write this into the chat, but the audience member asked, I was wondering if the panel could comment on the reported success of HBCUs to graduate STEM majors and prepare students in STEM in comparison to the poor retention of STEM majors at predominantly white institutions, using the classic predominantly white strategy of feeder classes. Thank you so much.
Yeah, so if you look at the top 10 institutions nationally for graduating Black students that go on to get their PhDs in STEM, the entire top 10, except for one, are HBCUs. And the one that's not an HBCU is University of Maryland, Baltimore, which is tied for number 10. North Carolina A&T is in that list. Howard University is in that list, as well as many other public and private HBCUs. And the rest of the list, and this is the top 50, 22 of the top 50 are HBCUs. All of the institutions that are not HBCUs, except for two, are Research One institutions. So these are institutions like Harvard or Stanford or University of Michigan. So it's something that the Harvards and the HBCUs are doing that other institutions can't, but they're doing it very differently. What Harvard is doing is they're creaming. They're giving the valedictorians, the ones that have the best qualifications to go. HBCUs they're much more big tent institutions. They select a cross section of students, but they still end up educating them without the weed out courses, as the person who questioned stated. And how are HBCUs able to do that? Because we build up and we don't weed out. We are used to accommodating all types of students. The students have a much closer connection to their teachers. A lot of times they're not being taught by graduate students, but they're taught by the actual professors who are doing the research. So a lot of HBCU students, they end up engaging in research very early in their careers. But one of the most important things is if you look at all the Research One institutions, the percent of their Black faculty members is about 2%. If you look at HBCUs, the percent of our Black faculty members is in STEM is over 50%. So they're able to see a Black person that looks like them that have a STEM degree. And I think that's very powerful for them to see.
Yeah, I mean, speaking from the #1 graduator of African-American women in engineering, African-American students in engineering. I concur with what this last speaker said. We have a different mission. Our mission is to empower our, Black and brown students that come in the door. And I'm sorry, I spent half of my career at, HWIs in Research One environments. And that's not what I experienced there. Okay, there were pockets. And so when I was in the University of California, we founded the California Alliance for Minority Participation, which you all today know as the Lewis Stokes Alliances for Minority Participation. But we had one before even the Lewis Stokes program. And as an assistant professor, when I came to UC Irvine, within 4 years, I doubled the number of URM students, Black and brown students, earning degrees in my field and also presenting research papers at the campus-wide research symposium and winning prizes at the university level, winning the national level. And what we did is we basically created a not only a community of practice, but a community of solidarity inside of a very hostile environment. And that's of course difficult for minority faculty at HWIs in the Research One environment, because even though these institutions say that they support these activities, in many ways they don't. So, and one other point that we should make for the audience is that leading in producing, African American STEM degree recipients, you need to put that in the context of the fact that only 6% of African American students attend historically Black institutions. And so with our 6%, we're outperforming the other institutions that have the other 94%.
I'll just say really quickly, as someone who is at a historically and predominantly white institution, and I like that term historically because it puts into perspective here the intentionality of that history's, that institution's history. That is precisely right. And starting very often when I see instructors who say that they care about diversity, who say that they care about retention of their diversity in STEM, also do things like, instead of empowering, or go out and endeavor to fix. And that is exactly the wrong perspective. That is the reason that we have so many of these different programs, why we have HBCUs, why we have had McNair, because they didn't set out to fix students. They set out to empower them. And then one last thing I'll just say is that we need to hold ourselves accountable beyond the numbers. So numbers are great and excellent, but bringing in a diverse set of faculty or a diverse teaching force who are going to leave in a few years, we have to hold ourselves accountable for that. And we have to find out why, and we have to fix whatever issue that is, instead of making it a box that we check. And so if we do those things, I think that we can really, like Dr. Graves said, we need to put our money where our mouth is. And if we're bringing in teachers that we know are going to have an increased burden on them because they are engaging with students of color, we need to pay them. We need to compensate them. And we really need to be intentional about that.
Thank you so much for your amazing answers and your time and sharing all your thoughts, Dr. Brooks, Dr. Tolson, Dr. Graves. And with that, I'm going to hand it back to Erica. I believe there are some concluding remarks.
I know we've come to the end of our hour, so just want to say thank you to Dr. Brooks, Dr. Tolson, Dr. Graves, and Dr. Samuels. Thank you so much for such an engaging conversation. We see we still have questions that are now populating in the chat. So please do this. Look for a survey. We put information in the chat about how you can maintain contact, particularly like with Dr. Samuels, if you have questions about LabXchange or extended questions. We want to make this a series. We want to continue the conversation. So we thank you for joining us today. We thank you for being a part of this inaugural experience for STEM Funders Network. As you saw in the chat, we are completely appreciative to LabXchange and to the Amgen Foundation. The Amgen Foundation is one of the members within the STEM Funders Network, and this is what we want to do. We want to amplify, we want to elevate, we want to uplift the great programs and initiatives that our funders are supporting that will make a difference and are making an impact. Please join us for the next one, March 22nd at 1 p.m. But again, thank you for today. Thank you for the graciousness of your time. We don't take it lightly. Blessings to everyone. Again, Dr. Brooks, Dr. Tolson, Dr. Graves, Dr. Samuels, thank you, thank you, thank you for everything that you're doing and sharing that out today. Thank you, everyone, for being here.